Okay, thank you all for joining us and welcome on behalf of ORF for this very interesting event, a book discussion on a very important and engaging book by Daniel Markey, uh, just recently released by Oxford University Press, titled China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. And it is important for us, I think, to discuss this because we have discussed a lot in recent years. The argument about China and the Indo-Pacific. And I think the geography that we have sort of discussed less and that continues to exert enormous amount of India's diplomatic capital as well as world's diplomatic attention is Eurasia. And Dan has penned a very interesting book, very engaging book that maps out that entire terrain that not only looks at South Asia, but also Central Asia and the larger Middle East. So I think from both scholarly perspective as well as from the perspective of a policy, as someone who's interested in policy, I think I found this book very, very interesting because it talks to two different audiences and makes a number of very interesting points. But I think the larger point that I think Dan is making here, the one that I want to put up front for all of us is sort of more academic. That often the debates around China's rise are debates about China and how China is manifesting itself in various forms. And this, if you're looking at Eurasia, what is China doing in Eurasia? What are its ambitions? What are its capabilities? But I think the question that is often less engaged with is the one that Dan in this book engages with: is to what happens when you have global and the local intermingle and come together, and how they frame how the smaller states frame their own responses, how the agency of smaller states constrains the ability of bigger powers like China to shape their geopolitics and geoeconomics. And I think that's something that Dan Markey talks about in his book. Very brief introductions. I have a great panel today. The author himself, Dan, is here. He's a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He has been at the Council on Foreign Relations, and before that, he held a South Asia portfolio on the policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department. So he has seen it all: policy, academia, and of course, think tank world. I have two discussants with me: Ambassador Nirupama Rao, one of our most distinguished diplomats. She served as our ambassador to both China and the US, and a former foreign secretary, of course. And also she's a scholar at the moment pursuing a project on Sino-Indian relations. So we look forward to hearing from her response to this book. And we have Jabin, Jabin Jacob, who is, I would say, one of our very few authentic sinologists in the country at the moment. He is associate professor at the moment with Shiv Nadar University's School of International Relations and Global Governance. So without much ado, Dan, I'll leave the floor to you, 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll give the floor to the two discussants. Before we open this up for a larger conversation, those who are participating, I would encourage them to send their questions, their comments, their observations in the chat box, which I will then collate and take to the discussants and the author. Dan, here you go.
Great, thank you, Harsh, and thanks to my fellow panelists. This is a fantastic opportunity, and I really appreciate ORF putting it on. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Harsh, you did a great job of summarizing the core, I think I would say, analytical point that this book really is trying to advance. And what I wanted to do was play that out a little bit more. And think also about the policy implications of it. Certainly, primarily, of course, I'm sitting here more or less in Washington, D.C. I'm quarantined in Maryland, so not too far away. But I'm sitting here and looking at this issue very much from an American policy perspective, as is reflected by my own background. And what I'm particularly eager to do is to get some impressions from an Indian perspective as well, as to how this type of argument plays there, and how it may or may not inform that type of thinking. But let me step back a little bit. The book opens in a way with this story of Gwadar Port, which I think is a familiar story, certainly to those in the region more so than to many Americans. And the reason that I open with this story is in part also the reason why I began writing this book in the first place, which is to say I come at this issue of China's role in its Western horizon, and that I take to mean much of South Asia, on into Central Asia, and even into the Middle East. And in the book, I really focus on Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I came at this issue from my own background in looking at South Asia primarily, and in particular from my last book, which was on the US-Pakistan relationship. And in that book, at one point, I was really focusing on what was new regionally. And the thing that was new and that struck me from the very beginning of my writing of that book, which now is well over 10 years ago, was the increasing involvement of China in many different aspects. Now, China is not a new feature in South Asia, not at all. And it is, in a way, more closely interconnected with Pakistan than many of the other countries that I look at in the book. But what I thought I was seeing was the beginning of something different in the way that China was engaging, even back then. And this is 2010, 2011, 2012, up to 2013. And I thought I was seeing something with Gwadar Port as an interesting storyline. And then eventually that evolved, and I think all of your audience will be familiar, into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and a variety of other broader economic and political engagement that we've seen over the past 5 years. But I wanted to tell that story of Gwadar because I felt like it was being mistold in much of the American strategic literature. And the way that it was being mistold is that it was being identified as a part of the now famous string of pearls type of approach to China's viewing the wider region, the Indo-Pacific region. And it was being portrayed as a kind of a potential strategic node in a larger network of places and potentially bases throughout the region that Beijing would have identified as strategically valuable to it, and that it, meaning strategists sitting back in Beijing, would have, looking at the world very Machiavellian-like, would have identified where they needed to place a Chinese presence, and then would go out into the world and make it so. And as I had conversations, particularly with Chinese diplomats, but then also with Pakistanis, I came to learn what at least the initial story of China's involvement in Gwadar actually was. And it was very much a story that was driven by Pakistan's interests, by, in particular, the interests of then President Musharraf, who approached Beijing basically and requested, to the surprise of his Chinese interlocutors, requested that they please help him build this port. And subsequently, when I had an opportunity to ambush him with an interview, I basically got the line, yes, very absolutely, this was my idea. I went to Beijing, I asked them for support. And from the Chinese side, I heard, and we were surprised, and we actually had to send some junior diplomats back to make sure that they were serious about having this port because we didn't think it was commercially or otherwise viable. He was serious. He implored the Chinese to get involved. They followed through. But the story, of course, doesn't end there. And there are two additional pieces to this. One of them is the reaction on the ground from Pakistanis, and in particular from those in Balochistan, who did not necessarily respond positively to this Chinese involvement. To the contrary, they saw a greater Chinese involvement and a greater, as they term it, colonial even, Pakistani central state involvement in Balochistan as something that threatened them on the ground, threatened their livelihoods if they were fisher folk living by the sea, threatened their broader interest in sort of political and economic control in their part of Pakistan, and threatened to turn the area into something that was effectively off limits and caged or fenced out part of the port that would keep the people of Balochistan away from their own, effectively their own property. And that was likely to, and has, I think, exacerbated existing what I call political economic or domestic political contentious politics and differences on the ground in Pakistan in ways that run contrary to the narrative of China's involvement bringing about greater development and a win-win opportunity for everybody on the ground in places like Pakistan and many other places as well. And of course, we've heard that narrative, that win-win narrative, mainly in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor being one piece of that. So part of what I wanted to do in the Gwadar story was to peel back some of the layers of what was actually happening on the ground in Pakistan and see how that kind of those obstacles were getting in the way of or otherwise shaping the types of investment or involvement that a country, even a much more powerful country like China, could have inside of Pakistan. And the other piece of it was I wanted to say, look, the story didn't end with that initial request by Pakistan. It didn't even end to build the port. It didn't even end as that effort kind of faltered over the next 5+ years. And it became clear that this port was kind of a port to nowhere. It was not terribly well connected up to any infrastructure of transit inside of Pakistan. It wasn't commercially viable. And it was effectively left to die by the Singaporean management company that was initially engaged. But the story didn't end there either, because the Chinese have come back again. And this is part of the broader story of China's greater involvement in Pakistan. It's the greater involvement in terms of this Belt and Road Initiative and the broader strategic and economic and political ambition of the Chinese state that's now, I think, reflected in this leader of President Xi Jinping, but which goes well beyond him, which reflects a broader Chinese rise that we have seen gradually over time, which is being consummated on the world stage now, and which is really quite apparent to everyone. And so I wanted to see that interplay between the very local, going down to the level of the fisher folk and their concerns about what's happening on the ground, and the very global, going up to the level of what China's rise means for the world. And so that's why I start with this story. But because I think, as Harsh pointed out so correctly at the outset, this is a story of the interplay between the two. And it's complicated. And it's not simply a story that plays out identically across the region. So when I looked at different cases, like Kazakhstan or Iran, I see similarities. I see a kind of echoed similarities, but it's not the same story at all. And I wanted to make that clear as well. I guess the other aspect of this is, as I say, I wanted to push back against this notion. I kind of ascribe it to the string of pearls mentality. That is, Beijing has a grand plan for the world and is putting that into motion and operates more or less in a vacuum. And I wanted to sort of quash that, or to at least make it more complicated than that. Simultaneously, out of China, I was, especially at the outset of writing this book, I was bombarded with Chinese characterization of what their grand world plan was. And it was all this win-win, completely not strategic, entirely commercially or economically oriented, no desire to speak of the political or certainly not the security ramifications of what they might be up to, even with major infrastructure investments in the region. And that too also struck me as terribly wrong. At the extreme, even sort of propaganda coming out of Beijing. But even for those who honestly believed that China was more commercially than strategically motivated, I wanted to point out that that motivation from Beijing might be less important than the implications of their actions on the ground. In other words, even a purely commercial or primarily commercial investment in a country like Pakistan will have clear political and even geopolitical implications, even if that's not intended by Beijing. And I'm not even inclined to say that none of what they do is intended as strategic. So, so there's clearly an important strategic component to this. So, so I wanted to find a middle ground between the everything China is doing is strategic and nothing China is doing is strategic, and to also play up the role of other actors in the region. And in that point, as I've explained, I wanted to use a kind of a two-level analysis. The one level is this domestic political economy. So I've talked about the Pakistan case in Balochistan, but I also play that out more broadly in Pakistan, making the point that there are winners and there are losers, and there are bigger winners and lesser winners from any involvement, China's involvement, certainly from the US involvement that came before it. Some in Pakistan are well placed to take advantage of investment. Others are not. Some will find their way to being at the center of Chinese-Pakistan sweetheart deals, economic deals. Others will be kicked to the side and will not even benefit from employment. That kind of winning and losing is common to most types of economic exchange, but it's sort of exacerbated when the extent of that level, or the level of that investment, Chinese investment in Pakistan, runs to the tens of billions of dollars over several years. And we see the same sorts of things happening, I think, in places like Kazakhstan, where China has invested in energy projects, beginning really after the last financial crisis, billions of dollars of Chinese investment in hydrocarbon projects, which have turned the character of Kazakhstan's core business away from a purely Kazakhstani and Russian combination to one that very heavily involves the Chinese. And that has implications for domestic views of China, and I think creates potential cleavages within a country like Kazakhstan, where some stand to win from that, those who surround former president, but still most powerful person in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev. Those who surround him see some of their business interests and political interests as very much aligned with working with the Chinese, whereas many in Kazakhstan are questioning, not least, have concerns about how China is treating its Uyghur population, its Kazakh ethnics within China, and that has led them to be much more wary and concerned about China. So you see a cleavage there. And a similar type of domestic political economy story, though it's harder for somebody in the United States to go and see in person, I didn't have a chance to go to Iran, is happening, I think, in Iran, where there seems to be an evolving cleavage between those, again, who see both strategic interest in working with the Chinese, access to weaponry, to tools of repression of their own people, as well as certainly commercial and economic opportunities with the Chinese, that Iran is at the moment especially truly desperate to have, in part because of US sanctions, right? So there are those in Iran who are very eager to work more closely with China, and yet there's a broader Iranian public opinion that is often quite openly skeptical and even potentially hostile to working with China. So those cleavages are evolving, and they're being, I think, in most of these cases that I look at, each story again is quite different, are being exacerbated by the greater Chinese involvement in each country. So that's one level of analysis. The other level of analysis that I wanted to look at was more of the regional geopolitics. So in each of the subregions that I look at, South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, I pulled in another major player. So in South Asia, obviously India. In Central Asia, I looked at Russia. And in the Middle East, I looked at Saudi Arabia. And here too, what we can see is China's involvement, greater involvement in Pakistan, of course, raises warning flags in India and has clear implications for the long-standing competition or conflict between India and Pakistan. And of course, in this case, India's own evolving competition directly with China. So that triangular kind of relationship is deeply affected the more that China is involved in Pakistan. And we can't overlook that. Even, as I would say, even if it is not China's goal or desire, strategic rationale to create problems with India as it gets more involved in Pakistan. India cannot help but be concerned about what the implications of China's greater involvement, say at the port of Gwadar, would mean for Indian security. So again, it's this problem, it's kind of a classic security dilemma if China is getting involved, or maybe it's close to that, but it's this notion that the more China is involved, the more India will have to respond, even if it's not an intentional part of their competition. Similarly, Russia will have to respond to China's involvement in Kazakhstan. And Saudi Arabia sees China's involvement and support of and commercial connections with Iran as directly relevant to its own concerns about Iran, and has at times worked to counter greater Chinese involvement in Iran, and will, I think, continue to do so. So those regional geopolitical relations were the second level of analysis that I wanted to look at in each case. Now, I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I guess more for American audiences, I felt like this region was very poorly understood or well known. We are certainly in the United States, when we think of China, we think more of East Asia, of China's relations with Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and so on, and much less about how China looks westward. And yet, it seems to me that this is critically important and likely to become even more important as these ties between China and this part of the world deepen. And I would even go so far, and I think others have voiced a similar observation, go so far as to say that China's capacity to compete as a global superpower may be fundamentally altered by its ability to cement its access and influence throughout continental Eurasia. That is, a China that has greater access to the Arabian Sea, upward to the doorstep even of Western Europe, because it has better ties with and deeper connections, deeper avenues for influence throughout that region, will have the potential to be a global superpower and capable of competing with the United States for decades to come, as compared to a China that is bottled up, as it has been historically, along its eastern coast, and where it faces a number of at least skeptical, if not outright hostile, and relatively well-armed and highly developed states along its eastern seaboard, not to mention the United States. So what China does to its west is important, and as I say, not terribly well understood in the United States. Last point, I suggest a number of broad policy options that the United States might take. And I'm very careful here because as a book, I'd like it to outlast the next presidential election to some extent. And for these options to be something that might be on the table either for a continued Trump administration or a Biden administration. And so I sketch them out at a higher level of abstraction, but they range at the one hand from kind of strategic withdrawal. That is to say, and I've heard this, by the way, many times in Washington, what China wishes to do in Pakistan, Iran, even Kazakhstan is really not of terribly great interest to the United States. And if they want to get more involved there, let them. It's a kind of a quagmire in the waiting. China can expend tremendous resources there and will get very little out of it. So the United States is better off just standing back. Now, a somewhat smarter version of that would be to say something like a strong point defense strategy, which is to say we should be very careful about who we pick and choose within the region to work with more closely from the US perspective. And if China gets more involved with a challenging country like Pakistan or Iran, again, that's not such a significant problem. So that's at the one end. And at the other end of the spectrum is a highly militarized competition where the United States should see China's advances in the region, including ports at Djibouti or ports at Gwadar or so on, as directly relevant to America's military posture in the world, and should work to counterbalance those wherever it sees the necessity. And that's an exceedingly costly strategy, one that I think, at least at the moment, the United States neither has the appetite or even really the capacity to implement. In between there is where, of course, I come down, and I'll end on this, with the observation that for most of US relations in the region, we need to be really thinking more locally, coming back to understanding what each of the individual storylines, really at the national level and in some cases at the subnational level, are in terms of how the people on the ground actually perceive China, because the United States has a lot to offer. And we don't always have to see ourselves as the anti-China. We can see ourselves as a state that offers, whether it's science and technology cooperation or educational cooperation or even military cooperation, that we can bring a lot to the table and be a valued partner throughout the region, and that we should be that, attempt to be that appealing partner. And the implication, the clear policy implication of that is we shouldn't approach each of these countries as with us or with China proposition. We should make ourselves an appealing partner in ways that will effectively continue to provide opportunities to keep open ties with many of these countries, and to give them options even as China's influence in the region grows. That's where we should try to position ourselves. And we should also consider that there are going to be opportunities and even the need to work with China in this region. And we should preserve a potential to do that as well, even as our competition with Beijing grows greater. So I put a lot on the table. I think I've run through my time. Harsh, thanks again very much. And I look forward to what my fellow panelists have to say and to the follow-on conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Dan. This was a great overview. And I think both Ambassador Rao and Dr. Jacob would be engaging with you on multiple aspects of this discussion. I just, just something that you said struck me that, I think even in India, there is a lack of understanding, especially of the Eurasian context of China's rise. We have been having this debate about the Indo-Pacific now for quite some time, and I think the discussion has become more vibrant. There is a better degree of understanding there. But I think with, the sweep that you have in your book from South Asia all the way to the Middle East also brings India into the picture in ways that perhaps are very interesting from India's rise as well as from Indian foreign policy perspective. Let me invite Ambassador Rao. Just a reminder to our participants that please send your questions, comments, and observations in the chat box, and I'll take them forward from there. Ambassador Rao, the floor is on.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I think Dan's book is interesting, fascinating, timely, necessary. I read through it with great interest. And what it brings out is essentially China's push west. The Germans would say Drang nach Osten. This is China's Drang nach Westen. And recently, The Economist had a piece on China's involvement in Central Asia, calling it the beast from. And therefore, obviously, its presence in that region has attracted and elicited a lot of attention and impact from the countries concerned. Now, as far as India is concerned, our land border with China, and essentially, we have a Central Asian orientation as far as our extreme northern borders are concerned. And we often do not see this from the perspective of the multi-regional country that India really is. We talk of the Indo-Pacific, as Dan and Harsh just mentioned. We talk of the free and open Indo-Pacific, but there's very little attention paid to the Eurasian landmass. And in the context of Dan's book, I think obviously for India, the China-Pakistan factor is a dominant piece of this narrative. But let me come to the points that I felt made particular sense from my reading of Dan's book. Now, he speaks of the character of the global order becoming much more fluid, and I don't dispute that at all. But to what extent is China poised to take advantage of this is obviously the question that we have to dissect. It would seem that the resistance against China is there. The United States, especially, we see that in the United States. And after the presidential election, the US presidential election, would it be better situated at that time, depending on if the Democratic candidate, Vice President Biden, wins the election, would it be better situated to activate coalitions of like-minded democracies that have a common interest in working together to contain Chinese influence? If it is a Biden administration, I believe this may seem much more possible. but it cannot be guaranteed either that China will emerge from the pandemic stronger and more dominant. It's too early to determine that. It would depend on how the Chinese economy rallies and to whether China will be able to bulldoze its way through the world in a scenario where it is seen increasingly as hubristic and expansionist and pushing at the margins. The other point was, I mean, you made it towards the end also, Dan, about selective and differentiated competition with China rather than, using a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think definitely I agree with you. This should be the strategy, but it will require very close consultation and strategizing between the US and its partners. The world talks a lot about Chinese diplomats today and the wolf warrior diplomats and them having drunk wolf's milk. And I was quite taken with your definition. You quoted Chou Enlai as defining Chinese diplomats as members of a culturally armed People's Liberation Army. And I think in many ways that description can be expanded to fit the contemporary scene as far as Chinese diplomacy is concerned. You see a loudly nationalistic, a more infantry soldier than diplomat, face to the world. And the mask of non-interference, I believe, has dropped. Talk of a community of shared destiny, as they say, I believe lacks all authenticity. Now, the other point was about China focusing greater attention westward after the pandemic, both to address perceived threats and to capitalize on opportunities. Now, if COVID leaves a vacuum with Central Asian economies devastated, does it mean that Xi's OBOR or BRI is transformed into a new edition of Chinese empire building with the rapaciousness that the Chinese are already displaying in considerable quantity? But knowing xenophobia in Central Asia and also the Russian overhang, will this really be possible? Now, as far as China's projection into the Eurasian hinterlands are concerned, this raises the question as to why the US and its partners have not conceptualized a free and open Eurasia strategy like they have for the Indo-Pacific. While we keep watch on the oceans, are we neglecting the heartland, however grandiose the Chinese schemes in the area may be? Now, as far as the China entering a new age, you refer to it, and obviously everybody calls it the Xi Jinping era, and how the post-revolutionary Mao era was characterized by China standing up, and the Deng Xiaoping era was focused on getting rich, and now in Xi's era, China is turning its attention to becoming powerful. Now, the intersectionality of wealth and power embodied in a rising China is not a comforting prospect, obviously, because China does not espouse the values of the free world or morality or internationally accepted rules of conduct. If it upends the world order as we know it, it will not just be a takeover, but a recasting of that order in China's image, or one in which, unfortunately, chaos reigns with no systemic structure, where China uses the instability to push its own agendas and interests and its so-called striving for achievement. Then, will China act with responsibility? I believe it will not act with responsibility under Xi Jinping. It will be agnostic about instability and conflict in most parts of the world, and will only intervene where it sees its own interests directly affected. Its role in Pakistan will, for instance, only intensify with ramifications for India. I believe China will be even more arraigned against India on matters concerning Pakistan and our relations with it. Now, what is the true nature of Chinese development assistance? We see it all around our region. Many smaller countries and economies seem oblivious to the details, and the devil is obviously in those details. So the same countries obviously will need to be presented with choices. To what extent can we offer them better alternatives so that they are not sucked into the Chinese embrace? Now, the more one recognizes the true face of Chinese power, especially in Eurasia, you realize how, even if these countries are not democracies, the scope for more freedoms, the scope for more, universal values being inducted into the region are under threat, because all over the world, obviously, there's a new brand of iconoclastic or hyper-nationalistic or xenophobic leadership, even in constitutional democracies. And we are creating more space thereby for a global order with Chinese characteristics. So what, in my view, China wishes to create is a global, what the sociologists would call an anomie, a global anomie, where no standards apply except those of, obviously, Chung'an Hai. And China is coming to Pakistan. It is determined not to fail in Pakistan. It is as if China is pushing her Western horizon to include Pakistan within its periphery. But I agree that the risks here for China are formidable. And like Xi's BRI, the next 15 years will tell whether China has dug a hole which may prove too deep and may severely curtail its grand ambition to be the sole superpower, or a contrasting scenario. I agree with you that there's nothing in Chinese diplomacy that reaches out to the population at large in these countries, even in Pakistan for that matter. It concentrates its attention on the elites and power holders, and very often on the authoritarian center and its hangers-on. Therefore, Chinese soft power can hardly have the provenance it should have if the common man or woman in these countries sees it as exclusionary and favoring either the elites or the Chinese themselves. The other day I was listening to this fascinating discussion with Evan Osnos, in which they were talking about K-pop versus C-pop, and how K-pop had rallied, to support the Black Lives Matter movement, whereas C-pop had been completely silent, that not a murmur from them about all, this expression of discontent that was happening all over the world, which is very much obviously in tune with all that the Chinese people are expected to do and be obedient to, to the powers that be in Beijing. So the point is whether Chinese power and economic statecraft, which is essentially naked, unbridled, and unfettered use of its deep pocket diplomacy to secure Chinese interests and obtain controlling stakes that eventually impinge on the sovereignty of recipient countries, should not be addressed by a well-determined strategy that creates a counterbalance to the growth of Chinese power. And just before I end, I believe that Russia's isolation by the West has made it bide its time and adopt a line of little resistance to China in Eurasia. There was this reference in a recent article that I read to the, Russia saying that even if it regards Eurasia as its sphere of influence, it's ready to embrace a greater Eurasia in which Chinese-led investment and integration dovetails with Russian efforts to shut out Western influence. Now, do we really want that in the long run? I think we have to also craft a strategy towards Russia simultaneously. And finally, I believe that the US cannot ignore the unchecked expansion of Chinese power in Eurasia, because it is only going to exacerbate the threat to international order posed by an increasingly aggressive and assertive China. So all this is part of the global strategic competition that you speak of, and therefore to ignore it or to deprioritize it has great risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And let me go directly to Dr. Jacob for his comments before I give the floor back to Dan, and then also take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Harsh. And thank you, Dan, for this book. I quite enjoyed reading it. And I'm quite glad to actually take off from where Ambassador Rao left off. What I'm going to do is try and look at it from sort of a big picture view. What I've done in recent years is sort of look at China's activities specifically in the context of South Asia. And Dan's book actually sort of, looks at the Eurasian spectrum. And so I find that it is important to note or sort of highlight certain key commonalities or key takeaways by which we should be looking at how China operates not just in South Asia or in Eurasia, but generally around the world. So what are these key sort of common points that we see? Number one, despite China's size, power, and wealth, these host countries of the BRI, the Lilliputians, if we might look at them that way, are not without choice. Just to look at Eurasia, the Central Asians actively play the China versus Russia card, vis-a-vis these two large powers, but also vis-a-vis each other. So that's one point. The second is, it needs to be acknowledged that many countries actually actively choose China. Iran is a good example, Pakistan, of course, in our own immediate neighborhood. And the reason is, of course, that China offers goods, economic as well as political, that are attractive to these countries. Sometimes it's only China that offers these goods, from a UN Security Council veto to cheap telecom infrastructure. There's nobody else that these countries can actually turn to but China, even India for that matter. A great example is the port of Chabahar, where India, the Indian entity that has been set up to run this particular port, actually relies on cranes built by a Chinese company that is actually banned in India itself. But it has no choice but to rely on these same cranes from this particular company to run its operations in Chabahar in Iran. Also part of this is the fact that the Chinese model is quite attractive to many countries. And this, I agree with what Dan says in his book, that China's deepening involvement will actually play to the advantage of several regional strongmen and sort of exacerbate both political tensions within these countries as well as with other countries outside the region, and complicates life for countries like the United States, no matter what end of the spectrum it chooses to play in South Asia or in Eurasia, or countries like India, which want to play a greater, more active role in its own immediate neighborhood, West Asia or Central Asia, or even Southeast Asia for that matter. Three, as Dan pointed out with examples from Pakistan, from Gwadar, countries have actually suffered because of engagement with China. In the case of Iran and Pakistan, local manufacturers have often been up in arms with respect to the ingress of Chinese products in their markets. Dan talks about fruit sellers and merchants in Iran, but even in Pakistan, it was only after several years of dilly-dallying that the Pakistanis finally consented to launch the second phase of the FTA. It was launched at the beginning of January this year. Fourth, these host governments have taken different approaches to acknowledging the problem that China creates within their countries. China is clearly a source of tension between governments and their peoples. One of the examples pointed out is how in Iran, the ruling regime is happy to do business with China, but the average Iranian on the street has problems with China because it is China that supplies the sort of great firewall, the telecom equipment that limits free speech and so on inside Iran. There are any number of countries in Africa. One could refer to how Hambantota blew up in Sri Lanka, not in any small measure due to opposition by locals themselves to the fact that the port, and not just the port, but 15,000 acres of agricultural land was part of this 99-year lease to China. Fifth, governments can actually complicate life for China. And one of the problems here is that, we saw how in Pakistan, Imran Khan comes to power on a plank saying that CPEC needs to be renegotiated, reordered, and so on. So at one point of time, the Chinese were actually beginning to get a little worried as to how this is going to play out. But there is, and partly this has to do with the fact that despite all these wolf water diplomacy and so on, in fact, I would say that the wolf water diplomacy in large measure is a consequence of the Chinese not actually having sufficient expertise on different parts of the world. And certainly, sitting in Delhi, I would say Chinese expertise on South Asia isn't so great. Certainly nowhere near as good as Indian analysis of China, despite, I would say, the greater number of Chinese analysts studying India and South Asia. There's the example that I think Dan also quotes towards the end of his book about Malaysia, how Mahathir's return to power offered the new government in Malaysia the ability to renegotiate several deals with the Chinese. And finally, it's also important to note that China also has choice, that it can actually choose sides. And as Ambassador Rao mentioned, it is not the case that the Chinese, it is not the case that the Chinese do not have a choice of picking India over Pakistan. I mean, they do not, even if they want to pursue the BRI as a purely geo-economic enterprise, they did not then have to complicate life by, say, arguing for bringing the Kashmir issue to the UN Security Council and, preventing the sanctioning of Pakistan-based terrorists and so on. So it is not the case that China is looking at it purely from an economic point of view. So I think I would like to sort of underline the point that Ambassador Rao makes, that China is actively picking sides, and that it is actually actively trying to complicate life for countries that it sees as its rivals. And the latest standoff on the border, on the line of actual control in India, I think is a case in point. Now, let me come to 2 or 3 sort of shortcomings I thought I found in the book. One, from an Indian perspective, a lot of this is actually quite familiar to Indian analysts, of course, to a specialized audience. But it is actually one has to acknowledge, this is actually a very competent putting together of many aspects of China's rise, and especially of an area of much, much interest to India. Having said that, I think I find it a little concerning that there aren't really much references to Indian analyses or Indian authors in this work. I mean, I understand that this is an American perspective, but I would say that even a country, if India is central to this entire enterprise of managing China's rise, and if the Americans acknowledge it in many forms, in fact, you yourself, Dan, say it at different points of time, then I would say that there is much that is written in India from various think tanks. I mean, the ORF itself is one. I mean, I didn't really find much inputs from the ORF, and I think there's maybe one reference to Harsh's own work in this particular book. So the ORF, the ICWA, which is one of the oldest think tanks in the world, certainly in India, the IDSA, the Vivekananda International Foundation, and even the Institute of Chinese Studies that I was once part of, a specialized research organization that deals with China's rise, China's politics, China's domestic politics. I think all of these need to be acknowledged in any American analysis if you are serious about involving India in this entire management of China's rise business. And thirdly, and it's a related point, I would say that, despite this area, this periphery, this area that you look at being within India's near neighborhood, India appears largely marginal to the entire process. I mean, there's a great deal of emphasis on history for sure. But, I think the fact that the sort of dyad is really India-Pakistan still in much of Washington, D.C., especially I would imagine in the South Asia department of the South Asia Bureau of the State Department, I think comes through very clearly. And I think that's problematic if we are to actually take, talk of the Quad, talk of, American support or American comments on the standoff at the LAC, all of that seriously. If not, India will simply play its cards, on its own and not really rely so much on the Americans. And possibly in this particular point in time, probably the wisest course of action. I would even say there's not even enough Chinese sort of sources. I mean, I do see that you've done several interviews and so on, but I think a little more attention to what the Chinese themselves are saying about their time, about their place and activities in Central Asia, as well as how they see the Americans or the Indians or the Pakistanis looking at their role in Central Asia. I think this needs to be understood a bit more carefully in order to sort of get our sort of responses to China's activities in this region properly. Finally, I think one strength, as well as something that I would have wished the book to look more closely at, which is the role of technology. It does not make much of an appearance in the book, but where it does, I think it's quite significant. I mean, I already mentioned Iran and the conflict between the Iranian Iranian populace and their ruling regime, owing to access to internet online freedoms and so on. But also there's this very important point about the Chinese chipping away at Russian technological dominance, both in the arms market as well as in general on online apps and so on. And I think Dan makes a very important point that in which he says that Beijing's risk calculus is quite different from other countries in the willingness it has to sell game-changing technologies to West Asia. And this is a concern for India as well, because this also creates temptations for Pakistan then to engage in the same process and complicates our neighborhood, our immediate neighborhood massively. We do not just have to look at Pakistan and China, but we also have to look at instability possibly in West Asia. So I think if, going forward, I think no matter what part of the world that we are looking to examine China's rise in technology and the impact, the sort of game-changing, great leap forward sort of approach that the Chinese take to using technology in their foreign policy outreach, I think is something that we need to pay closer attention to. And I think I'll stop it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jabin. And I would like to give Dan 2 rounds of questions. So I will just let him respond to some of the comments that Ambassador Rao and Jabin, both of you have made just now. I will, Dan, can I add one of the themes that emerged from both Ambassador Rao's comments and Jabin's comments is about how the sort of the China, India, Pakistan triangle, and because this is an ORF discussion, I think you can assume that would dominate. But in a sense, at one point in your book, you do mention when you're talking of China's involvement in South Asia, likely to exacerbate Indo-Pak conflicts. And I quote you, you say, this is not because Beijing intends such outcomes, it almost certainly does not. And I'm not so sure as to how you can make that assessment. And I think this is, again, something that Ambassador Rao also touched upon and tangentially Jabin also mentioned. I would like you to explore that in a bit more detail, because I think there might be a lot of people here in the audience who might not be willing to buy that argument as easily as perhaps you are buying it. Or you are telling it.
Absolutely. Look, first, let me say thank you to both panelists. Not that I'm surprised, but these were great comments. Very useful food for thought across the board, and some excellent connections being drawn in ways even that though I've made them in certain ways, this is very helpful. So thank you. It's great and exactly what I wanted. Let me just say, and I want to keep this really brief because I know we have questions and so on, but I will say that of the points that were made, I would highlight a few. One that I didn't make earlier has to do with the authoritarian surge or the democratic retreat globally that I think many of us are worried about, and China's role in that. And I think that what I have found in my research is, and this may, Harsh, get to a little bit of the point that you were making, but yes, there is a Chinese intention to, at least from my more liberal perspective, to make things worse, to make the world more safe for authoritarians internationally. And to get back to the ambassador's points and some of the more forward-looking analysis, if the United States does not see somebody like President Biden come in, who clearly is more concerned about that issue and more eager to work with both traditional American partners, ally partners who are liberal democracies, and also friends and other partners, including India, and to really highlight the centrality and the central difference between these liberal principles, both for global governance and internal governance, and to push back against and to really place pressure in ways that will make it more possible for more states to enjoy access to freer ideas, then we will be in a very different world than if we continue to see a Trump administration going the way that it is, with, I think, less of a concern about these issues and less ability to rally fellow travelers. Let me also say, just on the ambassador's comments, this idea of why not a free and open Eurasia policy from the United States. I mean, the short answer is because we have to make compromises in terms of the resources that we have at hand and make priorities on the basis of where our greatest interests lie. But the longer answer is that's exactly the type of thing that we should be heading down, even if it's a less resource intensive activity than we might be undertaking in East Asia and the Pacific, and I welcome that. And more thinking on that would be really helpful. In terms of, and just again, very briefly, I very much agreed with some of the observations that the professor made about some of the shortcomings of the book. And I think, you know, I'd like to continue doing more, and precisely the type of research that would draw on more local sources would be very welcome, and I should do that, and I would encourage, and I'd like to partner with people who are doing that kind of work. So thanks for pointing that out. And the one piece of this having to do with China's own discourse, you know, this related to where I feel my own competencies lie as a researcher, and I think that we all have a role to play, and that role is not the same for everybody. And given that I don't have Chinese language skills, and although I'm not that advanced in age, I don't anticipate I'll be developing these skills. I feel that I'm reliant upon others who have, and so I've tried to make use of what I could find there. But I agree, I think a lot more work there needs to be done and should continue to be done on uncovering what the Chinese are up to and what they think about what they're up to. The point about the role of technology is also critically important and weighed upon me ever more as the book was coming together. In fact, the bits and pieces in the book that are on technology, whether it's related to Huawei and concerns about 5G networks, or the broader concerns about Chinese efforts to help countries like Iran control and patrol their internet. These were relatively late additions to as my thinking evolved, and I recognized the greater centrality of control over data, infrastructure in the telecommunication space. That affected my thinking about China's political role as well in many of these countries, and how these countries and their peoples would see China. Last point, Harsh, I agree. I think that there are reasons to be very worried that China is actually looking for ways to make the India-Pakistan dynamic worse, not better. In other words, it's not the naive or neutral or even well-meaning partner that at times in the quote that you made in the book would suggest. There are great reasons to believe that. There have always been, right? China's support to Pakistan has always been seen critically as a means to make India's life worse. And perhaps we should continue to see it that way. I think that part of what I was up to was a bit of a rhetorical argument, which is to say, even if you were to believe China's claims that it doesn't mean to create greater problems for India, or you were to believe that China actually has great interests in a reasonably good relationship with India, billions of dollars of interests, and potentially much more than that over time. Even if all of that is true, you would still have to accept that its actions in Pakistan and with Pakistan and in the wider region make India nervous, and will make India nervous, and will prompt an Indian response, which is likely to be regionally more destabilizing or problematic in terms of regional peace than the alternative, right? So I guess it's partly a rhetorical device, right? Even if you accept all that China is saying, it's still problematic. If you don't accept what China is saying, it's even more problematic. But the argument still holds. That would be my claim there. Thank you again.
Thanks, Dan. And I know I have a series of questions here, but we don't have much time. I'll just mention a few questions which I think perhaps you can answer very briefly. One question which is related to the larger debate that I think the discussion that we have been having, someone has raised this point about is China targeting non-democratic countries? Because if you see your cases, they are clearly in one direction. And does that mean that we are looking at the democracy versus authoritarian binary in the world order going forward? Then there are a couple of questions on BRI, which is, I think, given how central it is to your discussion, perhaps you may want to reflect on some of these issues. One is, if you look at post-COVID phase, recently it has been pointed out by The Economist that BRI may have become a problem, but BRI can also become a sort of economic redemption for the regional economies and what is happening to the larger economic environment in the world. So do you see that in the context of the debate that perhaps the Chinese are having amongst themselves about the future of BRI and the world is having about the larger economic dislocation? And one question which I think is again related to BRI is in the Eurasian context of Russia and China. Do you see BRI becoming a trap for Sino-Russian relations? Russia is not part of it. In a sense, has been bypassed in the larger BRI outlook. So, do you see this becoming a problem going forward for this relationship that you discuss in great detail in your book? And lastly, there is this sense that there has been some outreach in terms of China engaging with certain countries, especially Muslim countries. I think some journalists from Pakistan were taken to Xinjiang to see the so-called freedoms that the Muslims are enjoying there. And will that have to what extent China will be doing that in the context of the larger troubles that it is facing with in terms of just upholding its own side of the bargain? And will that have any concrete impact in the way China is viewed in the larger Islamic world? So some of those responses perhaps. And finally, India-related question, which is when you talk about India, China, and Iran, is there room for alternatives there? India, I think Jabin talked about Chabahar, but do you see India and Iran relationship? How do you see that going forward in the context of what China is doing in Iran at the moment? So you're not obliged to respond to everything, but whatever you can will be much appreciated. Thank you.
Great, and we're already over time. Am I right on that? Yes. Okay. So I'll keep it very brief. Look, on the first set of issues, I think that it is telling that many of the countries where it appears that China has greater influence are the non-democratic countries, and it's expanding its influence significantly. And there are a couple of things about this. I mean, one is that there are many illiberal and undemocratic countries to China's western horizon. So at some level, it's a matter of who's actually in the neighborhood. But it's also, I think, a reflection of how China is more capable of operating with elite power holders within these societies, that is consistent with its own internal structure, and therefore it can, in effect, more carefully or capably mirror image. That is, it can work with undemocratic countries because it knows how it works at home, and it can partner with them without as great concern for things like free elections. And where China has tried to work with countries that actually have free elections, it's been unpleasantly surprised on occasion and has been sort of thrown for a loop. In at times Sri Lanka or elsewhere, it's seen that the implications that elections can have for a rapid and complete turnover of power. And Beijing is not comfortable with that. And so part of it is, where is China more comfortable, but also it's which kind of countries are more accommodating to Chinese interests, more capable of working with them in that way. On BRI, I do think very briefly that post-COVID could be very much like 2008, 2009 post-financial crisis opportunity for China to really expand its holdings, its equity holdings in large parts of the world, including continental Eurasia, where people will be desperate and where there will be what we would say fire sale opportunities available to Beijing, and which Beijing will be the one with the capital resources to take advantage of this. And countries will be, and their leaders in many cases will be desperate for the cash. And so that is a quick stepwise opportunity for China to increase its influence and involvement in these places. Is this a trap in continental Eurasia for Russia? I think it's a problem for Russia. And the ambassador earlier made the point about how Russia, in effect, was being pushed into China's lap by the sanctions policy of the West. And I agree, it is true. The terrible relationship between the West and Putin makes Putin that much more eager to keep open channels and ties with China, desperate even to keep those open. But the friction between China and Russia in Central Asia is also palpable. It is unclear to me how over the long term, Russia can continue to be the dominant external power in Central Asia when China owns everything in Central Asia. And increasingly when China is also involved in on issues like security, which have traditionally been Russia's domain. So I don't see that as a tenable long-term position for Russia. I don't know how it will square that, but it may be a post-Putin question because he's so much made his bed with the West. There's no walking back from that. With respect to Muslim countries, this is problematic in terms of China's treatment of its Muslims at home, and in particular the Uyghurs. It's not just that Muslim populations globally will think less of China, but it's also in many cases that they will think less of their own leaders who are turning the other way willfully and ignoring what China is doing. So it creates potential tensions within Muslim societies as well. And you see some of this in Iran, of people being critical of their clerics for having basically say, well, what the Chinese are doing is not such a problem. And it's creating rifts within Iran or exacerbating existing ones. And then last on Iran and India and China. Here, I think China, has the weight and the capacity to buy hydrocarbons at such a scale and a desire to be involved in Iran's energy markets and energy development at a level that sort of outweighs anybody but potentially the Europeans were they to come back. And that is not an easy place for India to be. But India still has, and has traditionally had, and will continue to have influence and access to Iran. I think one of the points that I try to make in the book is the United States has to play the Iran game certainly more carefully than we have been of late, but to recognize the geopolitical dimensions of it that go beyond the traditional concerns that we've had on the nuclear issue or on regional terrorism, and to think about what an Iran-China condominium would be, and to appreciate that some distance between them would be helpful. And to the extent that India also provides an alternative for Iran in many of these areas to China, strategically, that's not irrelevant to the United States. That may be something we ought to welcome rather than completely dismiss. So it's a difficult balancing act, of course, given all of the US interests and concerns about Iran. But I do think that India has a potential useful role to play. And of course, that serves certain Indian purposes as well. So it would be a complementary approach. So again, thank you to everyone, especially those great questions, and Harsh for playing moderator.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, Ambassador Rao. Thank you, Javan, for being with us. And I'm sorry I couldn't take, there were a few more questions, but we have completely run out of time. I would like to end with something that Dan mentions in his book, that US needs to be looking at area studies more carefully. That we don't have expertise, and I think that's something that I, as a student of international relations, would also like to talk about India. I think we don't. There are large parts of the world where we lack expertise, so we need to do more, and especially in a context where I think we have seen area studies grow in China, and I think that's something that we all need to ponder, both academics and policymakers alike. But Dan, thank you so much for a wonderful interaction. Thank you, Ambassador Rao. Thank you, Javan. It was great, and hopefully we can continue this conversation with your next book very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harsh. Thanks, Ambassador. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Harsh.
Thanks to ORF too.